Good evening, everyone. My name is Luan Kim. My research topic is about representation in Native American history. So, for literature review, how I came upon this topic is through researching about representation of Native American in the media. An article called Frozen in Time, a 2020 article, Frozen in Time, stated that Native Americans are often portrayed as historical figures. They are often either in a negative lighting or as in people of the past, and they're not really mentioned in the modern day society, which can affect the self-identification of Native Americans themselves and how other people see them as a marginalized group. So the other paper number 2 is of Mr. Hansen's class. His name, there are 2 other articles. The teacher's name are fake. I forgot the word for it. But Mr. Hansen's class, there was a case study conducted for his classroom. It was an 8th grade social studies classroom where Professor Stephanie conducted a year-long case study on both of them, but different classrooms. And it was more of a qualitative case study where the professor identified negative terms that were associated with whenever approaching Native American history and such. So there were multiple research that were looking into this, that were looking into how teachers teach us Native American history, and I wanted to fill in the gap of how students receive education on Native American history from their part, and that's my gap. So my research question is, how can history class improve Native American inclusivity for future student education? My method is a 2-step qualitative and quantitative case study where I gave out a general questionnaire which had 155 responses and 2 interviews were conducted. The qualifications are that the first interview is teacher A. She is non-native, but she teaches history, and she has a teaching experience of 14 years. As for teacher B, she is also a teacher, but she does not teach history class. She teaches literature, English literature, but she also has a teaching experience of 17 years. And both of them are relatively new to the school that I conducted the research in. The teacher A, it was her 3rd year teaching in the school, and teacher B, it's her 4th year teaching in the school. So my hypothesis going into this research is that I believe that there would be a low score rating of learning pre-colonialization Native American history and having deep, in-depth Native American present-day topics and issues, which would affect their recognition skills in section number 2, where they would not likely be able to recognize the image number 1 of a historical figure and image number 2 of a picture that symbolizes a modern Native American movement that is currently happening. So as for the survey, as I said before, first section is mainly focused on students' experiences and how they rate it from a 1 to 5 Likert scale, 1 being no, so 1 being I have not learned any of this or no knowledge of it, and 5 being I have adequate knowledge of pre-colonizational Native American history taught to me, or we have adequate discussions of Native American modern day topics. And then for the second section, it is a recognizational skill test for students. So the first image, as I said, is a historical figure that is very infamous in the Native American, very infamous whenever being taught Native American history. It is an image of Pocahontas. And for the second image, it is the MMIW, missing and murdered Indigenous woman picture. And then for the third section, it is optional because it takes more time than the first two sections, but it provided students with a 6-minute video, a YouTube video that says the first Thanksgiving, what actually happened. And the video is actually quite unbiased, that's why I chose that video. And it goes in depth to what happened and what the first Thanksgiving was. And students were able to rate their prior knowledge and how accurate it is on a 1 to 5 Likert scale. 1 being I had no knowledge of this, and 5 being I had adequate knowledge of this. So the results. There were a total of 155 respondents, and for section number 1 and 2, and as I said, section number 3 was optional, and there were 100 respondents out of 155 that volunteered to do it. So the demographic of my research is that it is majority of seniors and freshmen compared to juniors and sophomores. And I asked the question, have you ever taken Oklahoma history? And it was a 95.5% yes for most part, but 4.5% of the students did say that they haven't taken Oklahoma history. And I asked that question because Oklahoma history is a history course that is required for this specific school, and is mostly taken during the freshman year. And I wanted to make sure that most of my high schoolers had adequate experience in learning Native American history, but it is not that significantly, it doesn't have that significant impact on it because we have been learning Native American history since 8th grade. I just wanted to make sure that most of them did have adequate Native American focused history course in high school. So for the results, most of them, the first section is pre-colonizational education. It is roughly normal. I forgot the word, but I thought it's symmetrical, and I thought it would be roughly skewed to the left, which would mean that students mostly did not have adequate lessons in Native American history. And the present day discussion of Native American topic and issues was more of what I hypothesized. It is significantly skewed to the left, meaning that most students did not have adequate lessons or discussions of Native American discussions or topic that are influenced in their daily life. As for the second section of my survey, the recognition skills, it's around 69 to 70% did not recognize the images that were provided to them. And then of the 30 to 29% that did recognize, around 1% of them were able to recognize it for the first image and the second image. So that further proved my second part of my hypothesis. And as for the third section with 100 respondents, it is roughly symmetrical, which was not what I hypothesized or originally believed would come out from my survey, but most of them had adequate lessons and moderate lessons in the true nature of Thanksgiving and the history behind the national holiday. As for the results of my interview, teacher A, the history teacher, said that she is very open to having more perspective into teaching her classes, and that she personally teaches parts of Native American history throughout the whole year, from Unit 1 to Unit 7. Unit 1 focusing on the late 1800s with the Dawes Act, and then Unit 7 focusing on Civil Rights Act and American Indian movement. And then as for teacher B, she is the Native American teacher that I interviewed, and she stated that even the most recent history course, Native American focused history course she remembered taking was in College of Native American Literature, and that quote, she said, it was so insignificant that I forgot, unfortunately. So I believe that most students in the survey and the teachers have insignificant amount of lessons of Native American history. And she encouraged that teachers to be more confrontational with their students and being more open and creating a healthy environment to improve that Native American history and to provide more accurate history and perspectives to their students. For my discussion, my hypotheses were particularly proven to be truthful, and because they were proven right, I believe that we have a duty of improving Native American history to students and have more implementations of having more perspective in history courses and providing more representations in Native American history. All right, my limitations is that I originally wanted to conduct another interview with another Native American teacher who is at the school, but due to scheduling problems, I was not able to interview her. And then for curriculum, the history teacher that I interviewed, she was specifically a U.S. history teacher. I believe that in further research, I would focus on having history teachers in general, providing a survey for them so that they would have their voice in saying how they feel when teaching Native American history. And then for the sample size, as for another limitation, I kind of hope the sample size would have been bigger, but at the same time would have been more specific. So for further research, I would go into a history class specifically. So I would focus on U.S. history students instead of having the whole high school population take the survey. That's why we're excited.
Some questions, okay.
Wait, stop. No. What minute?
12:38.